ties us all together as human beings, one of the things that is common to every one of us is regret. Every one of us can look back at our lives and see so many things that we wish we had done differently. And we all wish we could go back and just rewrite some parts of our lives. Like maybe there's some person in your past and you wish that person was never part of your story. You'd like to just write that person out of your story. Or maybe something happened in your family and you didn't handle it very well and people got hurt. And you wish so much that you could just rewrite that part of your story. Or maybe you just made a really bad decision somewhere along the way and you paid a terrible price for that. And you wish so much that you could just rewrite that part of your story. But we can't. We can't rewrite what's already done. In my story, there's this whole part of my life where I got really lost. And I made some really bad choices, and I wound up living on the streets for years. And I wish so much that I could go back and rewrite that part of my story, but I can't. I can't go back and rewrite what's already done. But you know what we can do? Every single one of us, we can rewrite the end of our story. We can rewrite the end of our story. And the reason I say that is because of this one man who lived 2,000 years ago. A man named Jesus. It's because on a Sunday morning 2,000 years ago, Jesus came back from the dead. And I believe that because of that, because of the resurrection of Jesus, every one of us has the opportunity to rewrite the end of our story. Let me explain that a little bit. So Jesus dies in a brutal public execution on Friday. And they had beaten him nearly to death. And then they drove nails through his hands and his feet, and they raised him up on that cross, and he died there. And just to make sure he was dead, they drove a spear through the side of our Lord Jesus. And so Jesus was dead. He was very, very dead. And then they laid his dead body in a tomb. And they rolled a stone across the entrance to that tomb, just in case. They didn't think Jesus was going to get up and walk out of that tomb, but just in case somebody went in there, stole the body, tried to make it look like he got out. They even posted a couple guards in front of that tomb, which is a really strange thing to do. To have guards guarding the body of a dead man. But that's what they did. Then, on that Sunday morning, a few of the women who had followed Jesus, they went to his tomb. And they discovered that the stone had been rolled away. And there were these angels there. Which must have been an incredible thing to see. And the angel said to these women, "Why are you looking for Jesus here? He's not here. He's not dead. He has risen." Amen? It's an incredible story. It's an incredible story. And then those women, they run off and they tell the other disciples what has happened. They tell the disciples what they've seen. But the disciples don't believe it. They don't believe these ones. Or at least they're really struggling to believe it, which is understandable because it's an incredible story. It's an incredible story. It's the Easter story. It's why we're all here today. Amen? Well, this Easter, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of people that we don't usually talk about at Easter, but they are very much a part of the Easter story. And these people enter the story shortly after all this has happened. And they know that Jesus has been executed, and they've heard something about an empty tomb, but they're not really sure what to make of all that. They're not really sure what to believe. Let's look at their story together in Luke 23. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Okay, so there's these two people, and we're going to find out later that one of them is named Cleopas. But these two people, they have left Jerusalem, and now they're walking along together on this road to Emmaus, which is a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And all this stuff has happened back in Jerusalem. Jesus has been executed. Probably these two people saw what happened with their own eyes. And now they've heard something about an empty tomb. There's some rumor about a resurrection. And so these people are walking along and they're talking about that. And they're trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what's going on. And then suddenly, Jesus shows up and he starts walking along with them. And it's interesting. It says that they were kept from recognizing him. In other words, I think something supernatural was going on. Like normally they would have recognized him, but for some reason now they are kept from recognizing him. But we don't really know why they didn't recognize him. It could be that they were just blinded by their own grief. Or it could be that Jesus had his robe pulled over his head. They couldn't see his face. And maybe that's why they didn't recognize him. We don't really know. But what we do know is that they're walking along with Jesus and they don't recognize him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place." Okay, so interestingly enough, these two people who don't know that this is Jesus, they start telling Jesus the story of Jesus. And they say, "Look, you must be the only guy around who doesn't know what happened, but Jesus was in Jerusalem and they killed him. And now he's dead. Jesus is dead." And then there's those 4 words. "But we had hope." Those 4 words. But we had hope. See, they had hoped that Jesus was going to be the one to change their story. They had hoped that Jesus was going to save them and save Israel. They had hoped. They had hoped that Jesus would rewrite the end of their story. Those 4 words, "but we had hoped." There's a lot behind those 4 words, isn't there? There is a lot behind those 4 words. And you know, I'll bet you if you live long enough, your story is going to include those 4 words too.
Come on, son. Read.
In fact, I'll bet you your story includes those words right now. Somewhere in your story you'll find those words, but I had hoped. I had hoped to be married by now. It hasn't happened. I had hoped that I would have children, but I haven't. I had hoped to never get divorced, but I did. I had hoped that my children would not be on this road they're on, but there they are.
Come on.
I had hoped that I would be able to conquer this addiction, but here I am. I keep going back to the same thing that's killing me.
Preach now. Preach, Pastor.
I had hoped to live a longer life, but the doctor called.
Jesus.
And the news isn't good. Oh yeah, there's a lot behind those 4 words.
Yes.
But we had hope. Those 4 words are part of your story, aren't they?
Yes. Come on now.
Those 4 words are in your story somewhere. Well, these 2 people on this road, they have a story too. See, they are the Jews. They are the Israelites.
Well.
And they believed not just in what their story was, not just in their personal story, but they had this story of a national identity. You see, they were God's chosen people. And that was a really big deal to them.
Yes.
They were supposed to be God's representatives on earth. God's glory was supposed to shine through them and reach the whole world. They were supposed to be living in glory. Only now, instead of glory, what they've had is suffering.
Come on.
Generation after generation after generation, these people have suffered.
Yes.
And so their story isn't good. Their story is, we are Israel. We spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt. And since then, we've been conquered and enslaved by the Babylonians. And then it was the Persians. And then it was the Greeks. And now it's the Romans who are ruling over us. And so it's just been group after group who have persecuted and ruled over the people of God. And so their story wasn't good. Their story wasn't good. And they had hoped. They had hoped that Jesus was the one who was going to change their story.
Well.
You see, they've met rabbis before. There's plenty of rabbis, plenty of teachers walking around Israel, and they promise power, and they promise change. But their promises always came up empty. And then Jesus comes along. And Jesus just spoke differently than anyone else ever had. Scripture says there was an authority to his words that no one else had, and people heard that. And Jesus had power that no one else had. And people saw that. They saw him heal people who were sick and give sight to the blind. They saw him raise people who were dead. They saw Jesus do things that no one could explain. And so they hoped. They had hoped that Jesus was finally the one. They had hoped that he would be the one to rewrite their story. They had hoped that he would redeem Israel. They had hoped that he would be their Savior. They had hoped that he would drive out the Romans. They had hoped that Israel would finally be free. They had hoped that the people of God would finally be living in glory.
Jesus. Come on.
They had hoped all these things, and they put all those hopes on Jesus. And then on that Friday, the Romans killed him. And so now he's dead. And all their hope is dead with him. And so they said, that's it, it's over. It's all over. We thought that he was the one. We thought that Jesus was going to be different. And so their story badly needed a different ending. Because all they could see was that Jesus had died on that Roman cross, and all their hope died with him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And so these two people, they're walking along and they're trying to process all this stuff. They're trying to process all that has happened. They're trying to figure out what's really going on in their story. And Jerusalem is in an uproar. It's chaos in Jerusalem because there's this rumor going all around about an empty tomb. People are talking about a resurrection. The whole city's in an uproar. The religious leaders, they don't know what to do. Roman soldiers are in the streets because they think there might be a riot. So it's unsafe in the city. And so these two people have gotten out of town. And now they're walking along this road to Emmaus. And they're discussing all this. They're trying to figure it all out. Now look what Jesus says to them. He said to them, how foolish you are. And how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. You know, it's a funny thing. As a minister, I try very hard not to ever say anything hurtful or insensitive to people.
Come on.
But here is Jesus, right? And these people, they're confused and they're hurting. And Jesus says, how foolish you are. What fools you are, and how slow of heart. Of course, if Jesus walked in those doors right now, he'd probably say the same thing to every one of us. Amen. How foolish you are. And how slow of heart. But then Jesus begins talking them through their history. And Jesus begins reminding them of all the promises that God has made them. And what he's doing is, he's showing them that their story is not what they thought it was. See, they thought they knew their story. They thought they knew the story that they were living. And Jesus comes along and he says, you don't know. You don't know the story that you're living in. But let me explain it. And then Jesus goes all the way back to the beginning. He goes all the way back to Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt. And he takes them through all the Old Testament scriptures. And he shows them how all those scriptures were actually about him. Wouldn't you have loved to hear Jesus tell that story? Wow. Can't you just imagine Jesus saying, hey, you guys know that story about Moses and freedom from slavery in the Promised Land? Well, that's really about me. Because I am the ultimate freedom from slavery. And I can lead you to the ultimate promise. All that stuff was about me. And he takes them through the prophets and the kings and the great heroes of the Old Testament. And he says, all those things were pointing you to me. Your entire history is pointing you to me, and that's the story that you are living. You ever feel like you knew the story you were living in, and then you got some new information, and it turns out you really didn't know it all? Has that ever happened? Like, you ever been in a relationship with somebody, you thought you really knew that person, and then you get some new information, turns out you didn't know them very well? Did that ever happen? Like you thought the story was going this way, then you get some new information, turns out it was going that way all along.
Come on.
Does that ever happen to you?
Come on, preach now.
I heard this story once about an old couple. They'd been married for 60 years. And in 60 years, they didn't keep any secrets from each other. Except for one. It's just this one secret. You see, there was this shoebox. And it was on the top shelf of the closet. And the woman had put it there when they were first married. And she told her husband, I can't ever tell you what's in that box, and please don't ever ask. And so in 60 years, there's just this one secret between them. But then the woman got really sick, and the doctor said she wasn't going to make it. So they had to get their affairs in order. They had to prepare for her death. And so one day, that old man, he went to the closet, and he got that shoebox down, and he took it to his wife. And he said, honey, can you now show me what's in the box? And she said, okay, let's open it. And so he opens that box, and he looks down in the box, and there's just these two little dolls, just these two crocheted dolls, and like $50,000 in cash. And the man's overwhelmed, and he's looking down at this, and he says, honey, what is this? Why do you have these two dolls? And she said, well, when we first got married, my grandmother gave me some advice. She said, anytime you get angry with your husband, don't fight with him, just crochet a doll instead. Whenever you're angry, don't fight, don't argue, don't yell, just crochet a doll. And so that's what she did. And now, all these years later, that man is looking down in that box, and it's just these two dolls. Just these two little moments of anger in 60 years. And he just starts weeping. He says, honey, I can't believe it. Only 2 times in all those years you were angry enough with me to crochet those dolls. But what's with the cash? What $50,000? She said, every time I crocheted a doll, I sold it for $5. See, I love that story because that's the human condition. That's all of us. We think we know what's going on, right? We think we know the story, and so often we don't. You think you know the story that you're living in, and so often you don't know. See, these two people on that road, they thought they knew the story they were living. But Jesus goes to them and he says, you don't know. You really don't know the story that you're living. But I'm going to explain it to you. And he does. And he takes them through the entire Old Testament and he says, all of that was pointing you to me. Jesus changed their stories. Now, you and I are living in the story too. Every one of us. We're all living in the story. And our story actually has 2 major elements. And the first one is one you're all very familiar with. We could call it the American story. And it goes something like this. Be good boys and girls and get good grades in school. And if you get good grades in school, you'll get into a good college. And if you get into a good college, you'll make good money, you'll be able to buy a nice house and a nice car. And then one day you can get married and have 3 kids, and you raise your kids to be good kids. And then one day you can retire and maybe move down to Florida. And then that's the story. We've all been told some version of that story our whole life. Like, for some reason, that's what our lives are supposed to be all about. But there's another story behind that story. And this is a much larger story. And you're living this story too. And this story goes like this. So there was this couple named Adam and Eve. And they lived thousands of years ago. And we don't really know very much about them. We don't know if he was a good listener. We don't know if she was a good cook. We don't know much about them. But one thing we do know, we know that they really messed up. They messed up the one thing that God told them not to do. And they unleashed on the world this thing that we call sin. And we've all been wrestling with that sin ever since. And all you have to do is look out into the world to see that sin. It's everywhere. Turn on the evening news every night. All these terrible things that happen in our world every day. All you have to do is turn on the news or look out into the world and you will see that sin. Of course, you don't have to look out into the world. You don't have to turn on the TV. You can look in your own hearts and see the terrible brokenness that is there. Every one of you. All you have to do is look at your own hearts. You, every one of you, you've got a whole lifetime of pride and greed and selfishness and lust and anger. You don't need me to convince you of your sin. You know it's there. And listen, so often we think of sin as breaking God's rules. Well, it is. Sin is breaking God's rules. But it's also breaking His heart. And it's breaking our relationship with Him. And that's the larger story that you're all living right now. But as that story continues, God reveals His plan to deal with all that sin. God reveals His plan to overcome that sin. God sends His only Son to pay the price for your sin. And so we have the cross. And that's a hard story. That's a hard... We look at that and we have to wonder why God couldn't come up with a different story. Why did somebody have to be nailed to a cross? Why couldn't that story have ended differently? Well, I can't speak for God, but I do know that His ways are not our ways. That's right. And His thoughts are not our thoughts. And I'm grateful for that. Oh, I'm grateful. Listen, I need to know that my God's ways are much higher than mine. I need a God whose thoughts are much higher than mine. Amen? So I don't understand why it had to happen that way. But that's the way God chose to overcome all the evil in our world. That's the way God chose to overcome all the evil in your heart. But the story doesn't end there. Hallelujah. If the story ended there, if the story ended with Jesus dying on that cross, then those two people are walking down the road and their hope is gone. That's right. Their hope is dead if that's the end of the story. But something happened to rewrite the end of that story. Jesus came back. Amen. Jesus came back. Jesus walked out of that tomb. Jesus was resurrected. But even that's not the end of the story. Because when He came back, when He was resurrected, He said that we could be too. Amen. The resurrection changes the story. The resurrection changes everything. Hey, you remember those 4 words? What were they? But we had hope. Well, the resurrection changes those 4 words.
Yes, yes.
And now it's, but we have hope. Amen? The resurrection changes the story. Because of the resurrection, you can say, you know, my life may not be what I want it to be, but I have hope. Amen? Amen. I've suffered things I never thought I'd suffer, but I have hope.
Hallelujah.
I don't know how I'm going to pay all the bills this month, but I have hope. My health is failing, but I have hope. My children are suffering, but I have hope. This whole world's been cruel to me, but I have hope. Amen? Now, my guess is some of you need that hope. I know I do. And I think you do too.
Yes, yes.
Because your life has been difficult, hasn't it?
Well,
Yes. And you look out at the world and you see these horrible, evil things that happen. And if your story ends there, if your story is horrible, evil things happen and then you die, and if that's what you believe about all of human history, you can believe that story if you want, but I've got a different story.
thank you.
And I would argue that I have a better story.
Yeah.
My story is, yes, life is difficult. And yes, you're going to die. But because of the resurrection of Jesus, you can live again. And you can live again. And you can live again. And you can live forever in a world where horrible, evil things don't happen anymore. That's my story. My story is, Jesus rose again, and I will too. That's my story. Amen?
Amen.
That's my story. Now, if you're not really convinced of that story, if you're doubtful, if you're cynical, I understand that. I spent half my life there.
Come on.
But you should really want this story to be true.
Yeah.
Because isn't this a better story?
Oh, yeah. Hallelujah.
Don't you want to know that there is something after death?
Come on.
Don't you want to know that there will be justice in the end? Don't you want to know that there is a great reward waiting for you at the end of your story?
Yes, Lord.
You should really want this story to be true. Jason, would you join me back up here, please? I don't know how the rest of your story in this world is going to go. I don't know where you'll live or what you'll do or how you'll die. But one thing I do know. If you give what's left of your life to Jesus, then your story ends well.
Yes.
You can spend forever in a world where there are no more tears and no more sorrow. And that's the hope that you can have. And it doesn't mean your story is not going to have some more difficult chapters ahead. Things are still going to happen to you that you wish were never part of your story. But because of the resurrection of Jesus, you can have hope.
Yes.
Because of the resurrection of Jesus, your story can be rewritten. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, no matter what happens to you in this world, your story ends well. And that is the great promise of Easter. Amen?
Amen.
Listen, we're going to have our time of invitation now. And I just invite you to come this morning and commune with God any way you'd like. This is the day that His Son rose. Maybe you just need to come and tell Him, I believe that, Lord. That's my story, and I thank you for it. Help me take that story to the world. Maybe you're struggling today. Maybe you're hurting today. Maybe your health or your heart is failing today, and you want to come and claim some of that resurrection power. Maybe God just spoke to you today. You need to come speak back. But I believe this is the most important part of our time together, and I encourage you not to waste it. Come and commune with the God who raises